Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome today to our session on the textiles value chain. It's great to have you all here with us. My name is Muhammed Patel. I'm a senior economist at TIPS, which stands for Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. We are a research organization and we focus primarily on industrial policy and sustainable growth. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone here today for our session on the textiles value chain. So we have quite a power-packed lineup today and a great collection of stakeholders. Just in terms of the agenda for today, I'm going to do a brief introduction. Thereafter, we're going to have some key inputs on the research that's been done on the textiles value chain. That will take us roughly an hour, after which we move into a panel discussion session where we've got a mix of stakeholders from the private sector, from research organizations, etc., that are going to reflect on some of the research that's been carried out. At around 20 to 4 or so, we're going to open the floor for questions from our audience and from our colleagues that we can channel through to the researchers. So before we get into the main presentation, I just wanted to cover a few house rules. Firstly, you'll see that this is in a workshop, so it's not in a webinar format. So we would like people to stay on mute and switch their cameras off while the presenters and panelists are speaking. However, during the Q&A component, if you'd like to ask your question verbally, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question. So before we hand over for the presentations, I'd just like to say that this piece of research on the textiles value chain is certainly preliminary. It's in a format where we'd like to present it to you as stakeholders, and we certainly would like input and questions and answers. So throughout the presentations, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll also try to take them at the Q&A session at the end. Before our presenters take over for the presentation, I'd just like to introduce our two presenters today. Firstly, we have Dr. Nicola Jenkin, who's Director at Pinpoint Sustainability. She has over 25 years of experience working in the sustainability field with a particular focus on value addition to supply chains, sustainable food systems, and green skills to enable South Africa's economy to transition to one which is sustainable, just and resilient. Her activities include professional research, advising and developing CSR strategies, assessing resource efficiency and optimization along supply chains, identifying added value, sectoral green skills supply and demand, and socioeconomic research. Our co-presenter today as well is Elize Hattingh from TIPS. She's one of our researchers in sustainable growth and has been actively involved in promoting sustainable development for more than 15 years. She was the executive coordinator for Waste to Wing, a Switch Africa Green project, and the incubation manager at the South African Renewable Energy Incubator. Elize also actively supports youth-owned entrepreneurs at Youth Bridge Trust and women-owned entrepreneurs at Future Females Business School with business development support. So I'd like to take this opportunity to hand over to Dr. Jenkins and Elize, who will run through the very interesting presentation on the textiles value chain and some of the interventions that can decarbonize and move us to more sustainable production.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, and thank you also everyone for attending. I think what's become incredibly clear through the last few, almost year of undertaking this research is how hot this topic is, not only globally, but in South Africa. And that's really great to see. I think this piece of work certainly builds on a whole raft of activities that are currently underway. It was very timely in terms of it following not that long after the development of the master plan for the sector. And also there are lots of other current activities that all speak to this topic but with a slightly different lens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus predominantly on, I'm just getting my computer to, just hold on a second. I've got a dual screen here. So basically introduce what we're going to be covering today, and in terms of what the objectives were for this particular piece of work, in terms of our findings, an overview of South Africa's current textile sector, the climate change hotspots, given that this is the focus for this piece of work, and the proposed industrial, scalable and viable interventions. And here's where I will cover off the initial set of interventions and then hand over to Elize to take you through the others, including the proposed pathways of action, and then also the recommendations and considerations. We have, in terms of those last couple of points, due to the hot nature of this piece of work and the activity in the space in the country at the moment, we really have received some very valuable input, not only during the piece of research, but also afterwards. And it really is our intention, as Muhammed alluded to earlier, is to also hear from you, because as I'm sure many of you involved in research, it's never easy to capture 100% of the picture. So this is an opportunity to capture some more of the picture and build into where we go next. So the research aims and objectives of the project was to really look at the long-term future for the sector to ensure that it is climate compatible and environmentally sustainable. And this then feeds into the development of an industrial strategy for the textiles value chain. TIPS have undertaken this type of research in a number of other sectors, such as cement, for example, and some of you may have sat in on some of those other feedback sessions. I think what's really important here is the focus, the one being climate compatible and environmental sustainability. We're very aware that there are many other dimensions. There's the economic, there's the social, and this project really did tend to focus more on the environmental. However, we do in the report allude to the social dimensions, but it is clearly an area where more in-depth research can be undertaken, whether it's jobs or the social impact or the decency of the work. In terms of the value chain, we looked at textiles, and we were really interested in trying to provide an overview of South Africa's current textiles value chain. Those of you who are embedded in the sector know that over the sort of since the 1990s, how much it has changed. And also it's a very complex value chain. We want to try and unpack and really get to grips with South Africa's environmental and impacts. And as I mentioned, we do allude to some of the social and economic and the effects of those. And I think what's really important here as well is where we focus. We very much have focused on the manufacturing in South Africa. We do acknowledge that South Africa imports, whether illegally or legally, a lot of clothing, footwear, and textiles. However, the focus of this piece of work has been very much, or the lens has been on South Africa manufacturing. And then it's to really look at viable solutions and pathways to mitigate this. One thing that really emerged from this piece of work, and Elize will dip into it in a lot more detail, is those pathways pathways and solutions needing to align with what's already currently happening in South Africa. And through the piece of research, we were able to unearth many activities that provide solutions and already being undertaken by the sector to mitigate climate impact or environmental impact. We also became very aware that it would be absolutely pivotal that any pathway solutions should build on and be embedded in the master plan, and have proposed some solutions around that, which I have alluded to. And then as alluded to, there's also a lot of current work being undertaken, and we've been engaging with those various individuals to ensure that the work that we draw on aligns with, as well as feeds into other work. And we've got both Zubeida, who's involved in some of the Intex work, and we've got Sam Smart from Green Cape who are going to be responding to this research on the panel later. I've already alluded to this, but these are the key sections, and this is it goes without saying that we're going to be doing a very high level covering the essence of what has emerged from the research. The research report does go into a lot more detail, and thank you to those who've already provided some very valuable insights and suggestions for consideration. So the South African textiles value chain, in the broadest sense, or what was covered in here, we looked at clothing and textiles. Most of the noise, for want of a better word, the information is actually around clothing and textiles. Within textiles, you do see leather sometimes included in there, but within the master plan, it's broken down as clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather. And obviously textiles and leather are resources that go into the manufacture of clothing and footwear. We mainly, as I alluded to, focus on textiles and clothing. We do allude to footwear and leather. However, most of the activity is around textiles and clothing. We didn't include or go into depth and look at furniture and refurbishment or soft furnishings. However, some of the solutions would certainly be applicable to that. So, as I'm sure, especially those of you who work in the textile sector are very aware that there's no simple typical textile value chain, and it will really vary from product to product and what you're looking at. But just for an ease of reference, it is helpful to try and share some kind of picture of the main activities. So you have your raw material production, depending on whether that is like a PVC or some of your fossil fuel derived textiles or fabric. Then you've also got the agricultural ones that are more traditionally known, such as cotton, wool, leather, etc. And then, of course, you've got your livestock and exotic animals. And in the past, I've done work for an international fashion brand, and it always amazed me the exotic animals that were included in that, from feathers to skins. You then have the processing of raw materials, and this is where vast complexity of activities occur. And in the past and in certain areas, this is certainly where there is large environmental impact. And that's actually transforming the raw product into yarns and fibers, which are then transformed into fabric. So you have natural and synthetic, and you have hides. You have the spinning of fibers into yarn, the tanning of hides. And then the next most significant phase is the fabric and leather manufacture. Here you have key specific areas, and I think it's quite important to acknowledge those: knitting, weaving, and non-woven processes. And if you go into the report, you'll see that South Africa has a tendency currently to focus on I believe knitted fabrics, and had been involved in others, and then obviously finished leather. Those textiles, for want of a better classification, are then transformed into final products via processes such as cutting, sewing, pressing. This can be very automated or very manual, can be done at a very large scale, or it can be done by a very small entrepreneur working out of their garage. And then you have cutting and stitching, and that forms the actual garment or footwear. Then you have distribution and retail. Of course, distribution and retail occurs in wholesale and retail on large scale and small scale, also further downstream in the supply chain, but we tend to acknowledge it here with retail. This includes the buying, the retail through stores, and most significantly now, as you're all very aware, that can be in person in shops or online. And then also one can't forget that products such as leather are also used in other sectors, such as the auto trade, and it's pretty significant in South Africa. And then you have end of life. You have landfill, so to landfill sites, and then you may have it collected for reuse or recycling. You may have recycling or collection occurring also during the manufacturing process, and also product going to landfill. Those dotted lines indicate where product may go back into the system, and we will discuss briefly what we found on those processes and the occurrence thereof in South Africa. So the sector in South Africa, and I thought this was a very apt way of defining the sector, not only in South Africa, but also globally, is it's incredibly complicated. It's got numerous manufacturing activities. Not only that, they're pretty fragmented, they're not homogeneous. And the sector is very dominated by the retailers and the brands. These may be large or small, and they very much drive the product that lands up being sold or used or worn. Then you've also got small scale, and we really, we also noticed that in South Africa, you may have situations where you may have a large retailer or brand purchasing and selling product. They may have a primary supplier of finished garments, but those finished garments, parts of the garment may have been produced by numerous SMEs in smaller production spaces. So it really is quite complicated. And in South Africa, I will go into a little shortly, is around the picture of import. So in essence, while textiles or clothing may not be South Africa's largest sector in terms of its value, it is significant in terms of its contribution to GDP. It does, however, really employ, and this is current estimates, and it varies where you look. We couldn't quite get a clear picture, but at least over 200,000 people are employed in the sector. This doesn't take into account the expanded value chain, where you start looking at the agricultural component, for example. What is evident is that this is a declining trend, and these figures have declined since the early 1990s, and there are varying reasons as to the decline in the sector. However, what's become very apparent is one of the major emphasis of the master plan is to localize production, and that should have a positive impact on employee numbers, as well as some of the solutions dealing with, for example, the waste coming out of the system. One of the key components or characteristics of South Africa's textile sector is that we have shifted from being locally focused to being import focused. Again, the figures do vary, and there is a trend towards more local production. But just to give you some examples, there is about 61% of footwear, for example, is imported. And I do know that there have been comments on these figures. It's South Africa's textile sector is globally recognized, particularly for the production of high quality wool, mohair and cotton. However, there is a real juxtaposition here in the sense that because there has been a decline, and this is one of the reasons, because there has been a decline in production of clothing in this country, a vast majority of those products are actually exported and are transformed into textiles and clothing overseas. That goes into finished products that are consumed either overseas or in this crazy world in which we live. For various reasons, it might come back as products that we either are illegally consuming here or legally consuming here. And I just note here, and it's something that's not picked up here, is it's also recognized that we do have an issue in South Africa with illegal imports. However, it was noted that there seems to be becoming a better handle of dealing with illegal imports. But when we start looking at our solutions around enhancing the second-hand market, and Elize will cover this, it's a factor that we need to consider around not an unintended consequence of enhancing the sale of illegal goods. As alluded to, there has been a decline. This has been recognized by government, hence the master plan. A number of the reasons given for this was varied, from a lack of government support, whether financial, for example, difficult manufacturing conditions. Here really cost is a huge driver. Cost competitiveness is a critical variable within the manufacture and sale of both clothing and textiles in this country. And then an influx of cheap and illegal clothing and the need to compete with this, hence cost. However, as alluded to, there are signs of upliftment. I've alluded to the master plan. What was really interesting is if one looks at the trends of online sales for clothing and footwear, while this was increasing, it was expedited with the COVID-19 pandemic, with more people purchasing online and therefore becoming more comfortable with purchasing online. This is also not only just for large-scale retailers and brands, but you also see a proliferation now of SMEs in this space. There's also been a significant increase in pre-loved or the second-hand market, whether this is fashionable to do in terms of thrifting or whether it's a cost-effective way to access clothing and footwear. And this is not only in South Africa, but also globally. And we came across some very interesting statistics. The sector is certainly very much recognized, and as alluded to in our research, but also in the master plan, for its employment potential. And the union is very active in this space around ensuring that the work in this sector is of course decent and bargainable. And we particularly see in the solutions, some of the solutions that have been suggested around the employment potential. However, we weren't able to go into the specific details or look at maybe the types of jobs or the nature of that work. So what were some of the climate change related hotspots? And here we refer to hotspots that are more around if you think of those sort of Voltaren adverts where you have a hot spot on your body in terms of pain, a hot spot here would be where are those areas of significance in terms of climate change or environmental impact that required focus and required a more in-depth look in order to generate proposed solutions and pathways. What we do know is that the textile sector, both globally and in this country, and here our import story becomes particularly significant, really does create significant environmental impacts. And those of you in the industry would be very familiar with these. That's through resource depletion, uses a lot of water. If that water and chemicals, and if those are not adequately managed on site, they can pollute the water and air. It's a high user of energy, particularly in the manufacture stage, and then its toxic chemical use. And this is not to say that this refers to everybody in the industry. There's been a lot of activity to move away and mitigate from these. So the main greenhouse gas emissions impact really does vary depending on the textile type, the clothing processes adopted, etc., the dyeing, etc. But what really did emerge, if we look at a broad overview, is that the significant areas of impact are leather tanning processes, spinning of polyester, dyeing and finishing, and in-home washing of clothing. These mainly occur outside of South Africa because of that import story we have, and less processing and manufacturing occurs locally. What is particularly interesting as a global story is that 1/3 of the sector's CO2 emissions arise in China, and that is linked to the story around imports and China and other parts of Asia being significant producers of textiles and clothing for the rest of the world, including South Africa. Other key environmental impacts are around water consumption. That includes dyeing, finishing, in-home washing, and leather tanning. And here we're particularly looking at the pollution associated with that and the management of that water and byproduct from those processes. So here you're looking at tanning, dyeing, and finishing. And then in terms of waste, that would be in-factory offcuts. Particularly, it becomes a very interesting story when you're looking at exclusive brands, or if you take a brand, let's say like a Burberry, which some of you may be familiar with, where their brand design is very recognizable, their pattern. You might find it's very difficult to use those offcuts because, or to sell on those offcuts, because that is very much part of that company's brand. You then have a consumer throwaway culture, and in our report we share some of the statistics, but it's quite frightening, and it's often linked to this notion of fast fashion. And the way that and trending and this desire to always have something new. There are quite scary statistics on how often pieces of clothing hang in wardrobes that remain unworn. I think what's of particular interest, given this particular area of focus for this research, is that it's been estimated or assumed that only 13% of textiles that are wasted or whether at the end of their life or in the process are recycled, and less than 1% are recycled back into clothing. And you will see this becomes an area of significance going forward. So what I would like to share with you, and please, I'm conscious I am moving on to another section where we're going to be looking at some of the interventions that emerged from the research, is while we're going to be looking at Q&As towards the end of this session, as Muhammad requested, please do ensure that you put your questions, comments, or insights in the chat box so that we are able to capture that either going forward in terms of consideration for the report or when Muhammad takes questions and answers. So in terms of the proposed low carbon interventions, just to say those fun little smarty dots at the bottom, if you've had a look at the report, it's a way of being able to track the different interventions and very detailed graphic images that we have on those in terms of potential, priority, viability, and so on. But basically what we wanted to really ensure was that the development of these interventions and pathways very much aligned with not only areas of focus for our own master plan, but was also happening internationally. And a number of South African brands and retailers, as well as who they source their goods from, are involved in a number of international activities. These include some of the more significant ones that we allude to here. That's the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles sector. Here they have set a target for carbon neutrality by 2050 and to reduce the GHG emissions by 50% by 2030. And I think that is a very tall ask, but that does link to the UN's SDGs, which all have that target. So you will see that many of our pathways start to point towards these. And then you have the United Nations Climate Change Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action. This was proved to be very useful for us, particularly around solutions, not only talking with people in the South African industry, but also they had provided a lot of research into why to focus on certain interventions. And here there is a net zero emissions by 2050, which aligns with the EU strategy. So it makes sense that going forward that South Africa's climate interventions in this sector do align with that. That also speaks to our import story in this country. So while numerous interventions exist and many of you sitting on this call have solutions to many of the issues in this sector, what we really did want to do is focus in on some of these key interventions for decarbonizing the sector. That came from, we drew on intensive desktop research, interviews with a cross sector of the industry, including most of the associations. And then also we engaged on some of the findings with some industry stakeholders. So really in the start to talk to some of those key areas of hotspots. So we've broken down the interventions into two key areas. The one is reducing processing impact. So here you are looking at manufacturing, and then you are looking at zero waste to landfill. So you'll see quite a few proposed interventions in those. Elize and I are going to elaborate on each of these individually. These include reducing hazardous chemicals, energy reduction and switching to renewable energy. And then under zero waste to landfill, these are designed for recyclability and longevity. And here we have a particular focus on fiber to fiber recycling. You saw that figure of 1% earlier. And that's to enhance that figure. Reducing single use. And this really has elicited a lot of wow from our research. We unearthed some really interesting things here around sanitary ware and present some suggestions around that. and then shifting to leasing models, and then increasing the second-hand market. We haven't tended to focus particularly on local production and sourcing of local fibers, but what we really do want to say is, even though we didn't deep dive into this, all of this very much alludes to and aligns with all the discourse and dialogue that currently going on around local production and increasing that, and then sourcing of local natural fibers. So I'm going to go into the first one. I'm not going to go through all of the details, but what I would like to do is also suggest that we do go into also a lot more detail into the whys behind this and the data that supports this, as well as we present examples of what South African companies are doing under a number of our interventions. And it really is important to illustrate and indicate that South African companies and retailers are working to mitigate this change. So just some of the key things, you know, hazardous chemicals, as alluded to, is really big. You know, it's been suggested that over 8,000 chemicals are used, and these, particularly via water pollution, have a significant impact on not only humans and wildlife, but also the environment. So some of the interventions that are suggested, and we go into a lot more depth in these in the report, are the adoption of hazardous substance regulations and standards. And these are already out there. They may need some form of adaptation for South African regulatory suitability, but many in the sector we spoke to alluded to these already being out there and some already using them. What we've suggested is that these are adopted and prioritized along high volume clothing. To give you an example, that could be uniforms. And here one could start to look at the public sector and all the uniforms that they use. So one could start to look at the procurement guidelines for all the uniforms. And here you could, just by way of example, hospitals, medical sector, the prison service, the correctional services, police, and so on and so forth. And then you have as well, you have industry workwear. So there really are high volumes one could look at, as well as, you know, children's clothing, given the impact that that can have on, you know, hazardous chemicals could have on children. Then you've got retailers and brands to encourage them to specify non-hazardous chemicals. This can be done in a number of ways to produce procurement guidelines on what chemicals are acceptable, as well as guidelines on non-hazardous dyes. And we already know that those are being used in this country, and adopted restricted substances lists. And we do know that some of our retailers and brands are already adopting these. So how could that best practice be shared? Adopt technologies to reduce chemical use. And there's some interesting things out there, as we already know that some of these do come with cost implications, but these include, for example, laser finishing, using leather alternatives, particularly with the trend towards veganism and leather alternatives in footwear, for example, and then concentrated dyes or non-hazardous dyes. And then reuse water and effluent, so just having a much more enhanced and improved water management system on site, and to ensure that water is improved in terms of what is released into our environment. And again, here we do know that there are very bad examples in this country where there have been instances of water pollution, yet we also know that there are examples of industries that have been working on processes to improve water purification and management. However, as always, while one can put these forward, there are some significant barriers towards this adoption which need to be taken into consideration. There's obviously cost. If one's starting to look at regulations, you don't want this to become costly and onerous, such as licenses to operate, lab testing and audits, installation of new technologies and upgrades. So one has to always take into consideration the unintended consequences as well of adopting some of these interventions, albeit them being very valid. What it may also result in is reduced textile options. So if one was starting to have banned lists, that may result in reduced textiles or clothing that you can purchase, or you may have to shift to other manufacturers. And these all come with their own contractual complications. It may also include higher cost, that shift. Some of the key stakeholder actions in the report, some of you may be interested. For each of the interventions, we look at a stakeholder list along the value chain, and we look at the specific implications associated with each of those stakeholders and some of the considerations. So if you want to look at those in detail. But for hazardous chemicals, the textile manufacturers and dye houses, it's to adopt eco-index standards as REACH or similar, or to adopt new technologies where feasible. For importers, retailers and brands, to adopt chemical restrictions lists, these already exist, to start to really better understand traceability and audits of chemicals used. When I worked in the UK, I was involved in 2 sets of research where for brands where we were to go back right down and look at traceability of products, right down to looking at where are hides coming from in their products, even though they were selling them in the UK, and then also what was being used in those processes. And it was an absolutely fascinating exercise that brought a lot of insight and helped the brands to make decisions on what they wanted to do. So for example, with footwear, the hides were coming from Australia. The products were, the leather was actually being processed and tanned in places like Ethiopia. It was then part processed and turned into product components in Italy, for example, and then eventually sold in South Africa. So if one is starting to look at some of these exercises, you need to start looking at creating a really good understanding of your, for example, chemicals used right across that supply chain. And here it's always suggested that one looks at one's highest volume of products. So here that may be in tons or by sales. For government, that would be looking at including hazardous chemical reduction in the current master plan, and you will see many of our suggestions are to expand on the work that's already been done in the master plan, to expand on where environment, for example, has been alluded to, and to develop that in a lot more depth. So that may be guidelines, procurement of corporate wear, school uniforms with reduced chemical use, and monitoring and enforcement. So that's the story from hazardous chemicals. Again, please do feel to put information or questions in the chat. And then just finally from my side, I'm going, oh no, I think this is my second to last one. I'm going to cover energy consumption. And many of the statistics alluded to the significant usage of energy in manufacturing. And globally, the usage of energy contributes to 80% of GHG emissions in the textiles value chain. So it really is significant. In South Africa, as we all know, many of you are probably sitting here right now in a situation of load shedding. Not only are we energy insecure or unstable, but we suffer from high energy costs. So anything to mitigate this, as alluded to earlier, cost is a significant variable for action in this sector. So anything to reduce those costs and to become more stable in your production processes can only be welcomed, I'm sure. Energy management improvement could realize a net potential which is vast. So you're looking at 90 million tons of GHG emissions reduction. So these are some of the very useful insights that we drew on from global studies. They've also suggested that by reducing 45% of GHG emissions, you could reduce 45% of GHG emission savings just from looking at energy efficiency in raw material production, preparation, and processing. So this really points towards this being a significant area of intervention. And given that TIPS and the DTIC are particularly interested in manufacturing, this becomes key. So the proposed interventions are to adopt energy efficiency opportunities in factory, that's both processing of fibers and yarns, and then manufacturing of clothing and footwear. This includes, for example, adopting energy management programs, maintenance of machinery, upgrading machinery, and new technologies. We go into a lot more energy efficiency activities in the report. And then I also wanted to allude to the fact that on a number of occasions when we were engaging with the sector, they did say that due to the cost drivers faced by manufacturers and processors, that a lot of them had already begun to look at energy efficiency. However, on the flip side of that, many said that there was still a lot of work that could be done to better understand energy usage in South African processing and manufacturing of textiles, to really focus in on some of the interventions in detail. The other, which links to sort of, I suppose, the instability of energy supply in our country, is this need to switch to renewable energy technologies, and notably solar PV. And here there's been done some really good case studies and work by Green Cape, who have suggested that a switch to solar PV could save approximately 15% of electricity costs. And we do provide a link to that Green Cape case study. Another one is to also procure your energy from independent power producers. When we were doing this research, the government hadn't really opened up the gates to this and weren't really enhancing this. But in the intervening months, this has become very much more of a permissible activity by government. Some of the key significant barriers, again, are around cost. New technology does cost. It doesn't mean to say it's not understood that it exists. The same applies for upgrading. However, a lot of costs can be mitigated through improved maintenance. And then also the solar PV payback period. Again, it's very helpful to look at case studies such as those by the NPC or by Green Cape, which start to illustrate the benefits of solar PV investment. And then looking at government financial incentives, those do already exist. We list some of those that already exist, but it's about being more streamlined and communicating those opportunities to the sector. In terms of the stakeholders, these all just mirror what we've suggested to again. And then I think in terms of government, again, it really is alluding to trying to bring some of these into and discussing with the stakeholders how to bring some of this energy efficiency into the master plan and making it more viable as well as more obvious. So these are just some suggestions, and I'm sure Zubeida will be talking to some of these as well with the work that she is carrying out. So just finally from my side is looking at recyclability and longevity. This clearly very much links to two of the facts that or situations that we presented earlier. One was around the throwaway culture that we find ourselves in. Even though we know that there is thrifting that does occur and the informal market for secondhand clothing. I think what really was quite significant, and I'll reiterate it again as a point, is that it is estimated that only 13% of the textiles that are thrown away, and this includes clothing, are recycled. They're recycled into other things, carpets, furniture, etc., and less than 1% is recycled back into clothing. And then I think what becomes really important here is where does one start to focus their efforts to try and mitigate that. So we know that some of the reasons for the waste arising is through offcuts in processing and manufacture, damages. Somebody was telling me the other day about all the clothing that was damaged in the warehouses in the floods in KZN. And actually, even with severe washing of some of it couldn't be saved. It's no longer worn, or it's reached its end of life. And no longer worn and end of life are some interesting behavioral things around that. Then there's the minimization of production and manufacturing waste, and it's recognized that this can save greenhouse gas emissions. And here again, I want to allude to the focus of this research on climate change. So what are some of the proposed interventions? So minimization and recycling of production and manufacturing textile waste. So here a very good example would be is when you are doing patterning, really being cognizant of how much waste is generated. Is one using that full ream of fiber or of textiles that is coming in? Often there's computer-aided design these days that can help you to place pattern pieces to ensure that you are reducing both offcuts in the manufacturing process. So that is hand in hand. There's developing guidelines for increasing textiles recycling on longevity, and very good examples here exist overseas, and it's something we could look at and adopt here. The work that has been done, for example, by the Waste and Resources Action Programme in the UK, have done some really great work. And then let us not forget repair and reuse. This is a growing trend, but it's something that really should be considered. Often it's about maybe skills and knowing how to fasten buttons that have come off or replace zips. And here again, many of these interventions are great for SMEs. I know recently I took a jacket of mine to a small little entity down here, and he replaced the zip for me, and that jacket's going to last for another hopefully 20 odd years. And then to set recycling targets, these again can be discussed, but if we look at what's been done overseas, such targets may be 25% of textile waste to be recycled or reduced, just trying to mitigate it going to landfill and incineration. And to also mitigate it from going to landfill and incineration. And I think really what is quite critical here is whatever target is set, it needs to be with what is that activity. And that activity should really prioritize fiber to fiber recyclability. So what do we mean by that? That's if there is a garment or clothing, is to try and look at solutions that bring those textiles, maybe breaking those fibers down or part processing it so it can come back into fiber production or the production of finished products. And here I'm sure Sam from Green Cape will respond to that. And then the other thing is, some of you may be aware that in the last few years, the DFFE, the Department for Fisheries, Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, they released an extended producer responsibility scheme. They've been very active in the packaging space, and I think some of you sitting on this call today have been very much involved in that. And textiles are not one of the products on that, in that scheme, and we highly recommend that textiles are. And there are many examples overseas of textiles EPRs, which could be considered. What are some of the barriers? Again, cost, particularly when you start looking at textiles machinery, for example. It's not an easy process. It's costly. You're also starting to look at things like accessing feedstock, and logistics is often a cost consideration. The procurement of recycled fibers and textiles. If there's an EPR scheme levy, that means that there may be payments for members. And then also, if one is starting to set targets around wanting your manufacturers to have product with X% recyclability, recycled content in it, it may require a switch in suppliers. Then there's the implementation of an EPR levy scheme or some form of incentivization, as well as consumer acceptance and adoption. And I know that these have been real barriers, even given that thrifting and the secondhand market is growing exponentially, both globally and probably in this country too. And then it may lead to, this always comes up, is a potential reduction in manufacturing output as longevity is increased. So I suppose it becomes a fine balance around that and to be explored further. The key stakeholder actions are manufacturers assessing their current wastage rates. There are really good examples in the food sector where this activity is starting to happen. And retailers and manufacturers are starting to look at where waste arises in their areas of responsibility and why it arises. And that very much the same could be applied to textiles. And then off the back of that is starting to identify opportunities to minimize and recycle in factory, as well as procuring fibers and textiles that contain recycled content. I may add that it is possibly contentious, but it's felt that this should not be recycling rPET back into product, and there is debate to be had around that. For importers and retailers, it's to stipulate recycled content. We know that retailers and brands are trying that in this country. Then looking at recyclability and repairability, we already, I know, for example, I purchase shirts with buttons and extra buttons are provided. It may also then come down to the skills of the wearer on how to increase longevity. It also comes down to washing and so on. And then to identify suitable suppliers who may be able to provide you with that feedstock. In government, the same story about the master plan. And then what's been suggested is to develop recyclability and longevity guidelines. These already exist overseas. Could they maybe be adapted? And then what's also, and this is an overarching recommendation, and it links to the EPR, but many of these activities are very similar to what's happening in the food space. And in the food space, a food loss and waste voluntary agreement has been set up in South Africa. And many of the retailers who may be sitting on this, your colleagues in food, may already be signed up to that. And they collectively are now working on working groups and in a collective forum to really start looking at this. And one could start to build on the forum of stakeholders that were used to set up the master plan. So I'm now at this juncture going to hand over to Elize. So again, please do put comments and discussions in the chat. Thank you very much, and handing over to you, Elize.
Thank you, Nicola. Appreciate your insights. I'm going to keep it short and sweet because I'm quite mindful of our time, and I would really like to give the panel also an opportunity. There's some really interesting questions in the chat. Thank you so much for the engagement. Nicola, if I can maybe just point you to the chat on your sections, if you could maybe respond to that in the Q&A. We will have a 15-minute Q&A after the panel, so we'll make sure to answer your questions, and I will also drop my email address in the chat so that if there's anything that we've missed, I'm happy to respond in writing. So this is a solution I'm going to just briefly touch on. We've looked at reducing single-use sanitary ware. It's quite a topical and trendy area that I think many women would be aware of, new products, and also mothers that is looking at reusable nappies. But basically it's about circularity, that we acknowledge greater circularity in these products needs to be acknowledged, and also from a retailer perspective needs to be more accessible to consumers. So this includes the production of washable, multi-use, highly absorbent healthcare products, so your sanitary towels and nappies, and this could be including nappies for infants, but also for adults. So the result would be less waste, less pollution, and increase in social and economic impact. For the consumers, will have to be able to extend the use of the life cycle of these items, and thereby lowering the cost. So we've looked at even one of the interviews that we had with Pillay pads is pads that have a package of 250 for a number of different sizes for different body types. And one package like that can last a woman up to 5-year period. So we understand water needs to be available so that people are able to wash and maintain these items. So there is some challenges around that we've acknowledged, but we definitely feel very positive if the manufacturing of sanitary items that can also include natural fibers to stimulate the industry when natural fibers are available could be quite a big plus for South Africa. So that's just the two areas. And I think what is also important is to understand the barriers. We acknowledge that there's a consumer behavior, perception on hygiene that we need to work on, access to sanitation I've mentioned, and also upfront cost is a bit higher, but with the long-term saving in mind. And the stakeholders could definitely include your government procurement. There's a big drive in sanitary pad distribution for girls in schools. It's an item that you will, when you walk into a Clicks or a Pick n Pay or some of the malls, shopping malls, they all have glass bins, basically, where they collect, you can deposit, or there's crates even in Spar. Some of these big retailers and grocery stores are all driving to collect these items for women. And I think if we can consider more involvement in terms of procurement guidelines to support SMEs that's already producing these items, it's very beneficial to the sector. But then there's also the standardization cost. So we need to make sure that, you know, the quality of the products adheres to the standards, and there is a first reusable sanitary standard for the manufacturing of washable reusable sanitary towels. And we understand from a lot of the SMEs, there's still a huge challenge, a technical challenge to re-engineer their product to align it to these standards, and also a typical 250 upfront cost in terms of the testing for the items, and making sure that entrepreneurs and SMEs actually have access to finance in order to be able to make sure that the product's quality can increase. And then also recommendation for stakeholders such as retailers to start increasing the uptake of the products on the shelves. It'll be very interesting. I've been doing a lot of walkthroughs in shops to look at the different products, and there's definitely some movement, especially in the pharmacies like Clicks and Dis-Chem. Then also in terms of the washable cloth nappies, Sanku is a body that is driving this. There's about 10,000 members, a very big activity on the local manufacturing of cloth nappies, but there is some challenges also in terms of the different body types. We've got very different diversity of people living in South Africa, and we need to make sure that the designs of the nappies are not just from a European context, copied over, but we really cater to the South African market and make sure that the quality and we avoid leakage. So the barriers, again, in consumer behavior, access to water, and the product fit that I mentioned, a lot of leakage in the design. So there's a lot of scope for improvement. And the main stakeholders could be greater support from government to promote cloth nappies manufacturing, and also the South African Cloth Nappy User Association. I'm just mindful for time, so I'm going to go very quickly through our zero waste to landfill clothing and footwear leasing models. It's fascinating that global trends are showing us that there is a very, very big movement towards leasing clothing items, and this goes beyond just your wedding gowns and your evening wear. But in South Africa, it's still very much underdeveloped, and we need to prepare our consumers for these uptakes. The younger generation, they're much more aware of a sharing economy and happily more open-minded to rental models, and it can reduce cost and obviously reduce your footprint. And the consumers can benefit from a cost saving. So rather purchase less items and consider clothing rental models. So we think the interventions that's important to note is just the leasing models from retailers, big brands and SMEs. A lot of the logistics around that can be quite challenging. So the capabilities in the sectors would need to be increased so that they can scale, and obviously the online shops, systems and technologies to manage the delivery of the items, cleaning of the items and restocking. Also, if there's any damage or theft from an insurance perspective, there's different challenges that we need to look at. And the low-hanging fruit definitely is within schools. So many schools already have a second-hand school uniforms. They support circularity, and it's also important for children to understand and be aware that their clothing can be recycled in the system, or the schools can start a leasing system and also reduce the cost on your parents. So we also aware that the business model innovation is really needs to be increased, and stakeholders such as your SME business incubator sector, CEDA, and the other incubators could really work on capacity building for increasing online retail and rental models. And then zero waste to landfill. So we're looking here at increasing the clothing and footwear secondhand markets. Quite interesting for us that the fast fashion industry, is increasing 20% over the next 10 years, while the pre-loved market has a projected growth of about 185% by 2032. So a tremendous growth that we're seeing in the research. So the leasing models, secondhand markets, it's definitely going to be changing dramatically. And this is aligned to our circular business models, and industry could cut potentially 143 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This is insights by McKinsey's report in 2020. So the appeal is definitely to the Generation Z and millennials, and it can be more inclusive, definitely. If we are looking at second-hand markets popping up in neighborhoods, also it's reducing the cost, and it caters for all body shapes and sizes. So definitely becoming more inclusive. And we need to be very cautious on how the second-hand clothing impact local manufacturing. So there's definitely red flags that Nicola has raised in some of her points in terms of the job creation impacts that it could have, and also the illegal import of second-hand clothing goods. I know in the chat, someone did mention the clothing bank. We didn't do in-depth acknowledgement of them in the country, but I think the clothing bank is a very good example, definitely in terms of goods that can no longer be sold in retail stores. And there's different ways of working with SMEs to distribute the items in a legal manner. And then we're looking at online market interventions. So we're looking to see more online secondhand retail shops. So not just on Facebook and Gumtree marketplaces, but different types of online stores. The barriers definitely is to enable SMEs to adopt the resale models and integrate the technology. Main stakeholders, again, we would see the Department of Small Business and CEDA incubators to prepare SMEs, incubation programs, maybe definitely targeting SMEs in that area. And then the market interventions, so really to increase the physical secondhand markets infrastructure. We see a lot of trade happening literally on the streets, where there is no infrastructure, access to sanitation, People are selling their goods in weather conditions that's not ideal. And also it is making people vulnerable, street traders, for theft, and you know, it's not always so safe. So it could be very good to start looking at addressing trade licenses as well, because of the informality of these sectors, and government to maybe look at second-hand spaces and markets to be able to trade more adequately. This is just a picture I'd like to share just to see how the global second-hand clothing predicted market growth per region. So we're looking at North America 8 times faster than the overall apparel market. Europe is twice as fast. South America 4 times. Africa nearly 4 times. And Asia and Australia also nearly 3 times faster. So it's quite significant that people are willing to sell their clothes, and there's consumers who's willing to buy secondhand goods. So then I'm going to look quickly at the pathways for intervention. I'm not going to go too much in detail on this slide because of the time, but we've looked, you can have a look at the detailed report. We've looked at the implications of how the different solutions impact on each other, and the market pull and push, and also the eco-conscious consumer. Then we've looked at the decarbonisation viability to look at what is the capacity in the sector and the cost viability. So if you look again at the little smarty dots there, it's the different solutions that Nicola and I have almost spent an hour on today that we've put on for discussion. And what is the capability and capacity of actually delivering these? And then we've looked at decarbonisation over a certain time frame. So we looked at the capability, and we looked at the 2022 up to 2025 or 2055 timeline. What is an early win? What is early and easy, and what is going to take a bit longer? And then we've got a proposed action plan. I think this is just where I would like to pause for a little moment. We looked firstly at phase 1, the short term, looking at setting a carbon emission reduction target, and this needs to be agreed to by the sector and the stakeholders collectively. So I'm sure that a lot of stakeholder engagement will take place after the session today. And we're going to be looking at really low-hanging fruit.
Elize, sorry to disturb. I just wanted to remind you of time.
Not a problem. I got a big pride there. Thanks, Muhammed. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's basically a summary of what we've said today. And in phase 2, starting from 2026 to 2036, we're looking at a 10-year implementation for a zero net carbon emissions. And this will create structural shifts in the textile industry towards circularity. So you can have a more detailed look at what solutions we kind of packaged in there. And then very lastly, phase 3 is the long-term, the plan, the dream to reach your net zero emission targets by 2050. So we're all aware 2030 is the line that's been drawn in the sand. We can only escape, we cannot escape death taxes, and now also net zero targets. So we cannot escape that. Everybody in the world is accountable for the planet and how we are using different resources. So by 2030, we're peaking our emissions in South Africa. So that's just 8 years away. So if we're looking at 8 years, what can be done? And then for the big goal for 2050, how can we achieve net zero? So feel free in the report to go and have a bit more detailed look. And I'll just wrap up very quickly on the recommendations. So it's to acknowledge and align the low carbon transition interventions into the master plan. And we've looked at the different commitments which we feel is quite useful. And we've had some stakeholder engagement with the DTIC master plan team already. And to acknowledge and align with the international interventions and targets. So looking at the European Green Deal, what's happening there, and also the American Green Deal in terms of trade. And pathways and initiatives should be targeted and seen as stepping stones to achieve transformation to a low carbon sector. We know this is not realistic to happen overnight. We're very mindful that a lot has to be done in the sector, and to propose that we're setting a low carbon textile sector forum would be quite an instrumental lever to move some of these solutions forward if the stakeholders accept these solutions. And then to build on and to develop alignment with other South African textile sector projects and initiatives. And we mentioned the NCPC's the Intex program. GreenCap has done a lot on material flow and circularity of the city of Cape Town. And there's many other current manufacturer and retailer activities. And it's quite important that they are acknowledged Thank you very much, Muhammed. I will hand over to you to introduce the panel.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much for that presentation. So to both Nicola and Elize, quite a detailed presentation and quite clear that a lot of research and analysis and engagement that went into it. So I'd like to invite our panelists to switch their videos on. And I'm going to introduce our three panelists that we have today. And I'd just like to invite them to reflect on what we've been presented here today and some of the mitigation or sustainable options for the textiles value chain. So I'll start with the introductions, and then maybe I'll pose the question. So first we have, and please forgive me if I mispronounce any of your names or surnames. Zubeida Zwavel, who's the Executive Director of the Center for African Resource Efficiency and Sustainability based in South Africa. The NGO aims to support small to medium-sized enterprises by creating awareness and giving access to sustainability mechanisms and furthering women's roles with sustainable business. Then we have Hazel Pillay, who's the head of clothing at Pick n Pay. She's leading clear retail propositions for market share gains and is an inclusive leader for diversity of thought. Hazel holds an MBA from the Graduate School of Business, University of Cape Town. She offers special skills in driving the vision, setting direction, and exercising the hands-on leadership to transform poor performance and to affect growth and shareholder value. Finally, we have Sam Smart, who's Green Cape's waste sector analyst and a circular economy lead. He works to bridge the gap between the two driving forces of the economy, the mandate of policymakers and bureaucrats, as well as the markets of private sector business. His role is to gather, analyze, distill, and disseminate information related to the opportunities for and the barriers to investment in economically viable green technologies. Thank you so much for being on our panel today. And I'd like to invite perhaps a reflection on some of the interventions that have been proposed. Maybe we can go in the order that I went. So Zubeida, Hazel, and then Sam.
Sure. Thanks, Muhammad. I'd like to obviously congratulate Elize and thank them for the brilliant piece of work. I mean, it doesn't come at a better time. It's extremely important right now, and also knowing full well the importance of the clothing textiles value chain, including obviously leather and footwear. Just a bit of background to who I'm presenting right now or representing is I'm part of the Intex project. And with that, it is sponsored by UNEP. It is a project focusing on SMMEs in the textiles value chain, looking at two different components within South Africa. It runs across Africa, so there's two other countries, counterparts with us. And one of the projects that we're focusing on is eco-innovation and PEF. And so with that, it is eco-innovation and product environmental footprinting focuses obviously on trying to promote circular business models and, you know, these new business, sustainable business models with these textiles SMMEs within the value chain. So we've had very good engagement with the organizations, and just a little bit of context, over the last few days, I've actually been to KZN and visited a few textile companies part of this project. And you know, it's actually very sad sometimes if you go to these companies and you see the amount of pressure that they've been under. You know, specifically in the KZN area, they've been, last year it was the looting, this year it was floods. Obviously, all the companies in South Africa has faced COVID. And then other challenges they face are amongst things like fuel, rising fuel costs, energy, all of those things. Despite that, once again, these companies are surviving. They are sustaining real jobs, and they are under immense pressure. That's what I must say. But to that, they are an extremely important part of this, you know, zero waste and zero carbon emissions. an extremely important stakeholder that we have to consider. We have to look at where they're coming from, and also encourage collaboration, encourage more openness towards the textile sector. Looking at the different opportunities and pathways that was presented by Nicola and Elize, I must say there's a lot that is actually happening. And one of my colleagues, Andre Page, he mentioned also that, and he's from the NCPC SA, who's working with us on the Intex project, and he mentioned that they are also working on a UNIDO project focusing on circularity in the textiles industry. And that with that comes also the key focus of reducing chemicals and hazardous chemicals within the sector. So that's ongoing, and also the Industrial Energy Efficiency Project. And because companies have been faced with such a high amount of costs and pressure from that perspective, they have looked at, and I must say they've actually done a lot of things related to energy efficiency. And the Industrial Energy Efficiency Project has actually, there's quite a significant amount of savings in the sector and amongst other sectors as well. So I would say that the energy efficiency is important, and I think for now it's probably more important to encourage more companies to understand and also do proper monitoring and verification of whatever savings there are, and also showcase that further. And then with regard to zero waste to landfill, there's a lot of things that's happening with zero waste to landfill. Companies also feel the pressure in that regard, and they do realize that they have to reduce the amount of waste that they have. It makes sense for them to also utilize less virgin materials, raw materials. They also realize that, they have other business models that they actually looked at. And I think one of the things that was mentioned was the repair. And one of the companies that I worked with, and I will mention them because I see everybody wearing their jackets, especially in this cold weather, is the Pillay jackets. And Pillay is one of the companies that actually is already doing repair. You can take your jacket there after many, many years, and they will repair it for you, replace it for you if they cannot repair it. So there's a lot of things that's happening within organizations. And I don't want to take up too much time. I don't know if I am taking up. I want to give my other colleagues also a little bit of a platform. But I would say that with all of this, pathways and new business models, and encouraging organizations to work towards trying to reduce the emissions internally and trying to also collaborate, there's, government has to create an enabling environment. And I think that is what, and I wouldn't say lacking, in Tongaat, for instance, they haven't had water since the floods. And there's a company that we went to yesterday that actually had no water. Imagine operating with zero water. Luckily, this is not a company that requires a high amount of water in their processes, but this is a company that requires water just for drinking, and they have to fill up and then throw into the, into their systems, things like it. Very, very simplistic things, but once again, an enabling environment. And there is a large amount of incentives out there, but those incentives, is it actually then communicated? How is it communicated to the organizations? Collaboration amongst the organizations, because all of them are actually facing the same challenges. So what are they doing together? The one doesn't actually know what the other one's doing, and all of them are speaking something similar to along the lines of vertical integration. They have problems with their suppliers. They have similar problems with suppliers of raw materials or yarns or things like that, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. And that could be based on competitiveness. It could be based on other things, but there are opportunities to actually look at collaborative approaches. And obviously with the last few things Elize mentioned around the leasing and rental, those are business models that we are encouraging with the SMMEs that we're working with in the clothing sector specifically. And this has it's taking quite a bit of traction, and I would say that within South Africa, people are uptaking it very well, but it is still something very new and early. And I think consumer behavior and consumer education needs to be done from all, not only from the manufacturing side, but also retailers, and consumer education within South Africa really requires a large amount of efforts as well. And that is where that change in behavior will take place. So let me end there.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Zubeida. Hazel, over to you, and then Sam.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a great piece of work that Elize and Nicola have put together. I'm sure it must have been much of a struggle to try to condense it in this very short period of time. I'll go through some of the reflections. I think the reduction of energy, or finding more efficient energy for, and I'm going to speak more from a retailer perspective, is absolutely critical. It's something that we're in Pick n Pay Clothing already tested and investigating and rolling out from a solar perspective. And I think when they put down the stakeholders on that particular slide, it didn't really include retailers. But when you're looking at something from an end-to-end perspective, from start to finish, there certainly is many opportunities from a retailer perspective that we can apply energy efficiency ourselves. And I think from a retailer perspective, as I've spoken about end-to-end, this is really about collaboration. We are working back with our suppliers. I mean, I feel really happy to sit here and have so much research around sustainability. It's not completely comprehensive, but it's a lot more than what's been shown 3 years ago when we started our journey on trying to become more sustainable. We've actually worked along many lines of recycled products, incorporating better cotton initiatives, looking at using water-wise efficiency within our production lines. But there's a lot more to do, and I think it was already mentioned, some of the barriers are sitting with finding more cost-effective ways of doing this. And representing retail, we're always sitting in a dichotomy of how do we keep business sustainable, but at the same time make sure the product that we're offering our customers here in South Africa, as we know how challenged we are from an unemployment rate, how do we make sure that it is really affordable to them? So there's really that balance that we're navigating through. And what I can say is, for as long as you have an intention to want to change the way you do business and make it more sustainable and become a stakeholder in the environment that's going to be doing good, you will be able to find these opportunities. It's just really not, it's not a quick win. I'll absolutely call it a crawl, walk, run. And certainly for us in the last 3 years, where we started off versus where we are is just dynamically different from a product perspective. We're doing stores that are made from recycled materials. We didn't even have that store 3 years ago, but we have that right now. We're working with suppliers. In fact, we've got a workshop with our supplier base next Wednesday, really talking about sustainability, taking them on the journey, particularly from a local side. Most of the local manufacturers are burdened with keeping their businesses ongoing. So we need to be able to work back with them to emphasize the need for sustainability. We spoke about earlier, I think it was Nicola, who said that for some reasons, the sustainability part was not part of the master plan. And I think at that point, because I have sat in the meetings from the beginning, it was really about job creation. So in some ways, we are on a bit of a back foot, because if we did include it earlier on, we could have actually made a combined effort. But, you know, all's not lost. We can actually still work back with our local manufacturing to ensure that we're building sustainability in the output that's required from a retail perspective. In terms of reducing landfills, I feel very strongly about retailers becoming better at inventory management. So if we're having less waste in our system, there's less markdowns, there's less need for us to be working through product that nobody wants to buy. And that is that's super challenging. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's certainly something that we can unlock, and we're trying. Single-use sanitary ware, we're also working on our own product, but yes, absolutely think that is a game changer. With all of these different interventions, including leasing models, including secondhand, I think Zubeida closed off by talking about the consumer. So this is an end-to-end initiative, and each part of the value chain, and I take this on as a responsibility of retail, is how do we also take the consumer on the journey? You know, many consumers do want to shop fast fashion, do want something new. They're not quite ready, or they don't fully understand this. So we feel quite a strong responsibility in educating the customer. We've done quite a few sustainability initiatives in stores. We still get feedback from customers not understanding what it means. So our ownership is to really break down the communication and really play a big role in educating customers along the way. I think certain brands that are probably tiered from a middle price point to a high price point will find the secondhand modeling or participating in leasing models a lot easier. I'm still trying to unpack what this means for budget retailing. You know, who really wants to have a secondhand white t-shirt? I don't know. But while we're working that out, we are very big supporters of Clothing Bank. For the last year, we donated almost 10 million Rand to Clothing Bank. So a lot of our waste is still channeled through a means that is still being able to be used. I think for us in the value segment is how do we unlock other models? And I don't really have the answers for that. Some of the things we're struggling with, and I'll just close up with that, is traceability. More data. How do we measure across the value chain? What is the reduction in carbon emissions? And where do we find the systems to be able to do that? We will be relying on measuring this, particularly in our suppliers and our manufacturing segments. But at this stage, we're not very close to understanding that in detail. And I think other opportunities on the landfill will be upcycling. Again, I'm not sure how to do that in mass retailing. Single fiber product, you'll find what is really challenging in recycling fabrics is when there's multiple fibers. It's more costly, it takes longer. So how do we get more single fibers into our business is what we're challenged with. I think I'm happy to pause at that. But thank you so much for the presentation. I've learned a lot, and thank you for including me on the journey.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Hazel, for that detailed response. Sam, over to you. And sorry, Sam, before you start, unfortunately, I'm a victim myself of load shedding as well. And my battery seems to be on its last leg. So if I drop off, Gelo will take over from me to do the final Q&A and close. Let's hope it doesn't happen, but if it does. Over to you, Sam.
Cool, thanks, Muhammed. Yeah, fortunately, being in Cape Town, we don't get as much load shedding. And I guess this is also a good segue to indicate that if renewable energy is one of the solutions to tackling the greenhouse gas emission footprints of textiles, it's worth noting that the City of Cape Town recently allows for the sale of surplus renewable energy back onto the grid. The city will pay for it. It'll give you money for it, cash, SnapScan, whatever. So for businesses that are looking for a city whereby they can get reliable renewable energy, this strengthens the business case. So just putting that out there, Green Cape has a whole bunch of stuff on our website where you can have a look at, which touches on that. In terms of the report, yeah, I'm really excited about the reports. I think the TIPS team has done a great job. I look at this from a circular economy perspective. So from a materials and the resources that go into the extraction of those materials. And I think it's important from a circular economy or from a sustainability perspective that we don't look at this as being like, there's sustainability being this nice airy-fairy tree hugger approach. I mean, Hazel brought up all of the issues that the people she's been visiting have been having. So lack of water, too much water, we have food security rights. These are all things that are as a result of things like climate change and an unstable supply chain. So I think when we look at circular economy and sustainable textiles, we shouldn't be looking at it as pre-huggery, we should be looking at as de-risking. And I think this is really important. I mean, even if South Africa sort of localizes their clothing manufacturing, it's still highly reliant on imported fibers. And those fibers, even if those are localized, are highly reliant on imported fertilizers and oil. So essentially our whole clothing and textile industry is so reliant on quite an extensive supply chain that's also has a heavy greenhouse gas emission footprint. And so I think this report has highlighted that, but it also highlights some really great targets, or provides a great foundation for what I believe should be, at the very least, an association that has been set up that tackles these items. And if not an association, then a voluntary agreement that's been set up by the different brands. Unfortunately, I understand that if the entire supply chain or all the brands don't get involved, it does become sort of a competitiveness issue. So then if the industry can't come together and sort of can't take the pain themselves, then government does need to step in to implement what I think the EPR approach is worth investigating. And I think this is really important because this affects everyone, not just one particular company. This is across the board, including importers, which are also heavy competitors. So the EPR, I think should be sort of a priority, because within that EPR and within the voluntary agreement, you can put in place certain targets. And I think we already have the regulation that allows it, the framework regulation. So it wouldn't necessarily be as difficult to set up EPR regulations around it. Yeah, so I think the EPR is the number one. And in supply chain de-risking is number two. The inventory management, I think, is also important. We saw Zubeida bring this up. I mean, with the work we've done with the clothing and textile industry is that the industry doesn't have a clue of how much waste they're generating and the volumes and what that volumes looks like in terms of the profile. And it blows my mind that if a company doesn't know what its waste is, how do they know how to cut costs and reduce overheads and to reduce liability? And so I think there needs to be a great amount of work that needs to get those numbers up and running. I think the retailers that are online, or the brands, they have a packaging team. They're busy going through this with their EPR, and I think they should really go and chat to them and understand how they are working this out. Then the last one was with metabolic. So there's an association, a consultancy in the Netherlands that does quite a bit of material flow analyses for circular economy, and they did a really great MFA for Taiwan. And if I can give anyone some advice, go have a look at their website and look at their work in Taiwan. I think that is the sort of work that needs to be done for South Africa. The other thing that is also worth noting is this sort of idea of a just transition. So there's so much fear around job losses within the renewable energy space, but also, I guess, from sustainability in general, people are worried that if we shift to a more sustainable, more circular economy, that there's going to be this sort of mass loss of jobs within agriculture and other sectors. And I think I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but so much of our clothing and textile industry is so reliant on those imports from other countries. So if we shift away from, for example, raw fibers and shift attention to secondary fibers, such as through fiber and fiber, then we start seeing actually more local jobs being produced, not shifting jobs from one sector to another. So it is a bit fortunate, but unfortunate, but also fortunate for us. So we've got a great opportunity to work on that. And then lastly, something that I've been thinking about is the localization. So the master plan talks about localization, but there's a couple flags. So the one is like, where along the value chain does that localization happen? In my opinion, it should be at all the way to the fiber space. But the problem with that is that fiber production, as soon as you start localizing any sort of agriculture, manufacturing and that, you are localizing resource consumption and security, supply chain risks, you're localizing waste and pollution, you're localizing increased energy demand, water demand, and then lastly, you localizing greenhouse gas emissions. So really, I mean, it's we need to look at the circular economy approach, whereby we, instead of relying on virgin materials to localize all of those things, we should be focusing on secondary fibers. There's a couple other things, but I think we'll come into that a little bit later. But I would just like to see that a circular economy lens be added to that master plan. The circular economy approach ticks all of their boxes, and it's really hard to see a negative associated with it.
No, great. Thank you so much, Sam, for those reflections as well. So I'm also trying to be conscious of time. We wanted the session to be somewhat interactive. So I'd like to open the floor to our participants and our colleagues to pose their questions to the research team and the panel. You can, if you'd like to have your question, if you'd like to ask your question personally, you can stick up your hand and we'll unmute you and you can go ahead with your question. I guess just to sort of kick off the discussion, while people are getting their questions together, is there sort of, if the panel had to identify sort of the single most important measure in terms of an intervention, where would the priority lie? And I do understand it's a difficult question because we've got a number of interventions, supporting intervention. And the second is the first question anyone has usually whenever we talk about what the future state of a sector or value chain is going to look like. Is everyone wants to know what's the employment impact, and I do understand that that's not necessarily the easiest task. First one needs to scope out what the potential interventions are before one can even embark on an analysis of what the employment impacts are going to be. So is there any sort of sense around, employment impacts and where along in the analysis does this sort of feature? It's a general question. So whoever wants to answer first, you can raise your hand. Sam, I see your hand is up. Maybe you understand.
Well, yeah. So for me, number one is there has to be a collaborative mechanism between the industry, and currently there isn't. I think the closest one, and I think one that should be strengthened or sort of looked at very seriously, is the clusters, the clothing and textile clusters run by BM analysts. I think there's a really great opportunity to leverage their network and their skills to actually, I probably shouldn't speak on their behalf, but to actually be that entity that unites the associations around sort of a circular or more sustainable clothing industry. But the reality is that, and Hazel brought this up, this idea that we need to be price competitive, but also sustainability. So like, how do you tackle them? And I think one of the ways you can do this is through extended producer responsibility. So the voluntary agreement is fine, but it's voluntary, so only the organizations that can join. But if you have extended producer responsibility that affects the entire, all the brands and the importers, then their price competitiveness is the playing field is now level again. There's no sort of ability to outcompete someone because you're not being sustainable. And then you're also ticking the sustainability box. So the question that you need to ask them within the extended producer responsibility is what are the targets? All the weed stuff. What are the nuances in that? And that can be dealt with at another time. The question then is like first go now is to start looking at extended producer responsibility. Then you can start adding things like greenhouse gas targets. Yes, it is largely a waste-focused mechanism, but there's nothing stopping the industry or national government from adding greenhouse gas targets, water targets, etc. Like, I think that's the one that's going to unite everyone in under one movement.
I would like to probably respond more on the job creation aspect, or or the concern about jobs. So as someone who is completely invested in growing local, and I can officially give you numbers, Pick n Pay Clothing has grown our local units by 97% from 2019 to this year. So there are still limitations in bringing more business across. One of them would be more accessibility into cotton grown in South Africa, different types of fabrics that could be potentially made here as opposed to imported from China. All of those aspects of the value chain are not in full potential in South Africa. Whatever the reasons are, investment to get it done, it takes hundreds of millions of rands to set up mills. But if we can unlock that, it still balances out the job creation for more opportunity for more South Africans. It really is an investment conversation, as well as a mindset, as well as a skills conversation. And I think including sustainability in local manufacturing will always have some level of fear if we're talking about leasing and second hands, but there's other parts of the value chain that will be able to create more jobs. And we need to still see that from an end-to-end perspective. Right now, from a cotton perspective and accessibility, it's a mind blow that I know some of the cotton that we source comes from Africa, but then goes across to other places in the world to be used for production. It's really, the value chain is not efficient in any way. And there's just a lot of work that needs to be done on the start from a fiber perspective. But if we can change those segments in South Africa, it's going to radically change how we increase the economical benefit to more employment, in my view.
Yeah, I'd want to iterate what Hazel was saying, is that it's quite important to then go, that is what I've mentioned. I think the vertical integration, having companies do, not be dependent on specifically getting their raw materials, whether it be yarns or actually their fabrics coming from China, India, Pakistan. And the pressures from that perspective is the fact that, looking at Pakistan, they're also facing huge energy costs. There's been floods. I have a company that actually went abroad to go over to Pakistan to go and check out, what are the challenges that's being faced by these suppliers. And there is just currently no capacity for those specific raw materials. They have to get it from these countries. And so, and also on top of the fact that companies initially used to pay like what, $2,000 or something like that, and now it's $12,000 or whatever for logistics for these shipping costs. And it's ridiculous that it's not ridiculous, but it's the reality. But it's quite adds a surmountable amount of pressure on companies. And so, going back to the fact that we do need this capacity, we do need more textiles, more weavers, more dye houses, printing capacity. Something as simple as when you're looking at a duvet, there's no wide weave, for instance, in South Africa. And there's no company that does that. So, it seems simple to us, but it's not being done. So all of that has to come from abroad. Adding to the fact that I think one of the, for me, it sounds like an obvious solution, but I think to go towards solar is something that a lot of companies have been demanding and been seen as the holy grail, for instance, to all their solutions, to all their problems rather. And it's something, for example, the IDC has funded the tourism industry, very small Airbnbs and guest houses, and they would pay a very, very good example of how, and they would pay for these solar panels to be set up to 1.5 million rand. So it's sufficient funding and it's quite successful, and it's been running for the last 3 to 4 years. So something similar for companies to actually tap into that financing, tap into a similar finance scheme and incentive, and make it easier for organizations to actually attain those renewable energies. And so that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Oh, great. So I see 2 hands up. Sorry about that, Sam, if you don't mind.
I won't be long. I just wanted to, I was just 2 points. I was in Italy for the Textiles Expo, Milano Unica recently. And I thought it was totally fascinating that everybody on the welcome stage was very concerned about the lack of labor. And I just thought, wow, there's an opportunity for South Africa. I mean, they're struggling to attract people into the textiles industry. Then is that not something that we could build on? And I know we've devastated ours, but if Europe is struggling to fill its labor force for the textiles industry, then couldn't we be producing textiles for them? There was one comment, and then the other comment about the clusters, Sam. I was looking into, I would love to know the answer to this, but is there funding available for clusters? Apparently the cluster program has been stopped by government, but then I heard somewhere along the line that they might be reinstating it. If anybody's got that answer, I'd love to hear that.
Let's take Enrich, and then we can revert back to the panel and our presenters.
Right, thanks, Sam. Name is Heinrich Schultz, CEO of the Organimark Group, but also the board chair of the Global Textile Exchange. And I just wanted to sort of emphasize the fact that what we've seen globally is really a strong push for regionalization, as this has been proven in many cases to really support the decarbonisation drive. So what Hazel was saying is to take cognizant of the fact that if you look at South Africa or Southern Africa as a region, the fiber production industries have heavily invested in sustainability. I mean, South Africa is the world's largest producer of responsible wool and mohair. Nearly all the cotton produced in South Africa complies with the BCI cotton standard. SAPI has recently invested millions, hundreds of millions of rands in decarbonising their man-made cellulose pulping plant. So we sit with a vast base of sustainable raw materials, and if you do the full value chain assessment and you look at your typical LCAs from primary production all the way to consumer, a very large percentage of the impact that we are driving sits at the primary production level. So I really believe that an approach to integrated value chain programs driven by the retail master plan can take the advantages of these impacts at primary production level through into the impacts that we are driving as an industry, and I would strongly support that. Sorry, it's not a question. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, and I think that's really great to take us forward. I'm just going to hand over back to our panel and our presenters for just some concluding comments and thoughts. Fairly brief, maybe 30 to 45 seconds each. I'll start with Sam, if you don't mind.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Carol. Yeah, so I mean, for Jackie, I mean, even if the government wasn't funding the cluster, this is why extended producer responsibility or voluntary agreements are important, because here you're aggregating sustained financing to an entity, and all the brands are doing it, are paying mandatory levies to ensure that their products are being cared for at the end of their life. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, but this is why extended producer responsibility is so important. And then the other one is, I mean, I would really like to see this the master plan combined with, or at least a link to the cannabis and hemp master plan, because hemp production, we need to look at diversifying our textile space as our environments are changing. So do the stresses on our supply chains and on our different inputs. So by diversifying your textiles or your fibers, you end up diversifying or de-risking again your supply chain. And South Africa, and especially the Western Cape, is well geared for hemp production. So yeah, there doesn't seem to be much talk about combining those two master plans. So I would really like to see that, particularly as hemp is a carbon sequestration solution. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Zubeida?
Yeah, I think I've said a lot. I just wanted to add one more thing is that the skills, not shortage, but people wanting to work in the textiles industry, and we're talking about enhancing and creating new jobs and real jobs within these organizations and companies, which is quite critical. But people actually wanting to work in the textiles industry is limited, and the skills are, the people are getting older, the machinists, things like that, very simple things, but these needs to be addressed as well. So training and capacity building and making the textiles and clothing sector and footwear and leather sector sort of a little bit more attractive, for that uptake is quite critical and quite important. But I think I've said quite a lot, and going forward, I think, instead of creating new organizations, the KZN cluster and the Cape Town clothing cluster, there's quite a large amount of organizations that's doing very, very good work. We've seen all the things that has been mentioned within the chats, and these have to be recognized, and we have to build upon that instead of starting perhaps new things. And there's a large amount of knowledge out here as well. So I have to take my hat off to some of the work that people's actually been doing that I haven't actually been aware of, that we can incorporate going forward into the SMMEs, and then making sure that these business models are incorporated and showcased, and then, spread it as far and wide as what we can. So that's my last 2 cents. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Zubeida. Hazel, over to you.
Thank you. I think what was really interesting about the 2 hours for me, I mean, Hendrik's point right at the end is just as much as we're all working on a sustainable journey, we actually don't really know what other people are doing. And it would be, I don't know what type of platform or one that doesn't encroach on competitive edge, but how could we join all of this so that somehow you could network and join more dots, like, for example, from my side as a retailer, who else could I access to build new ways of solving the problems that we're facing? And I think the only way to get a faster movement in this particular topic is really about networking, collaborating, and working outside of your normal spheres. I don't know what the answer is, but this is really what struck me in the last 15 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic for that. All right, Elize.
Voluntary agreements which do exactly what Hazel suggested. Can we borrow some of those? And maybe the likes of the NCPC could be a home for something like that, or the master plan where there is already a forum that has started. So thank you, Gaylor.
Well, thanks everyone. As the super sub of the day, I have the easiest job to just really thank Elize and Nicola for the work and the presentation. Thank you to our panelists, Sam, Zubeida, and Hazel, and thank you to Muhammed as well for moderating 99% of the session. And thank you to all of you for being present today and for the super vibrant presentations and engagements and comments today. Look forward to the recording, to the slightly revised version of the report that we will be publishing soon. And please keep the conversation going, keep in touch. I think we've started something great, so really look forward to engaging further with you. Thank you so much, and have a good day and week further. Until next time, thanks so much.